Well, thank you for inviting me to come to Mingo. It's always a pleasure to come to Spain. I've been here now a few times, and every time I come, I learn things. It's amazing how similar the issues of fire are, I think, in Spain and California in particular, since we both have Mediterranean climates. I think we have the same issues on the table. Today, I'll talk a little bit about California and the Western U.S., and then at the end of the presentation, talk about one of my favorite places in Mexico, and we'll talk about that. If there's any questions along the way, if you'd like to ask me something, I'd be happy to respond to anything. Here's the outline of the talk. One thing I think that people don't perceive in California very well is just how common fire once was. And we did a paper in 2007 to try to address that, just try to get an estimate of what fire used to do. Slower?
Yeah, slower. We are very interested in the topic, but not all people can follow.
I'll talk slower. I have a tendency to talk very fast. Well, I think Domingo talks fast too, as far as I can tell. So I'll talk slower. So this idea of just what fire once did, you know, it gives us a scale of really what the process used to do on land. And we'll talk about that for California. And then I want to talk about this place in northwest Mexico. It really is, I believe, a really unique forest. It's a Mediterranean climate, but it has some qualities of it. It's never had any harvesting. It was never been cut. And fire suppression doesn't begin until 1970. So I think it's really the last relatively intact forest landscape in a Mediterranean region. So we'll talk about that. And I wanted to give you an idea of just the challenges in California about fuel treatments, trying to reduce fire hazards, and trying to mitigate wildfire. So this is the first idea of just what did fire do in California? We're fortunate because we have fire records in tree rings, so we have something called fire scars. 200 years ago, 300 years ago, Euro-American people weren't in California, so we can get an idea of what fire once did in our ecosystems through the collection of materials in trees. So we can date those materials, and we can come up with an idea of what fire used to do before management changes the fire regimes. We also know that Native Americans or Indians used to burn a great deal in California, and we try to take into account as well how much they actually are burning. So with that record, we can get an idea of just how much fire used to occur. So one thing we found out in California, California is 40 million hectares, right around exactly 40 million. And 25% of California is a desert. So 25%, we actually don't have really any good idea what fire used to do in the desert. So from this analysis here, we removed the entire desert area. So we took out 25% of the 40 million hectares. So with that, we tried to make an estimate of what California used to burn pre-1800. We use 1800 as a period with very little influence from Euro-American people. And from our result, we estimate that 2.5 million hectares burned every year. 2.5 million hectares. You can imagine that is an enormous area, all right? And I think I've shown this to people in California and in Washington, D.C., and I think the first thing that people see that number and they're really stunned to think that fire used to be that common on the land, that it would burn on the order of 2.5 million hectares every year. And there certainly would be variation. This is just an idea of a mean. And we argue in this paper that it's actually a quite conservative estimate. This is by no means a large estimate, it's very conservative. And if you look in the United States today, from 1994 to 2004, that was a decade of high fire in our country. It turns out that the area burned in the entire United States of America was 88% at what we think used to burn in California on a typical year. So again, it just gives some perspective that almost the same amount of area that used to burn just in California today burns in the entire United States. And generally that gets people very excited. You know, because we have Congress, we have the president, we have initiatives, but the amount of area that used to burn in the western United States was enormous. And today, we'll see that it's really tiny. We took some statistics from California and tried to get an estimate of how much burns today. So from 1950 to 1999, we estimated around 110,000 hectares burn on an average year in California. So you can see the comparison, 110,000 hectares today, 2.5 million before 1800. So that's around 6%. So when I think about California and fire today, I say the amount of area burning today is a joke. It's a pittance. It is so small that you almost can't even record it in terms of what used to happen. So you wonder then how our ecosystems have changed, and they've changed dramatically. And they certainly have in our place as well. Now we can jump from all vegetation. So the previous slide was grassland, shrublands, forest. This slide just talks about forest. So from our same paper, we estimate around 450,000 hectares burn of forest in California every year. So about 100,000 hectares. And in June 2008, just like in Spain sometimes, we had a very big lightning storm. And that lightning storm started 3,000 fires in 2 days. So in 2 days, there were 3,000 fires ignited. That's a lot of fires for California in a weekend. And if you look at that area burned in 2008, it turns out to be very, very close to what we think historically used to burn in the state. That was an interesting year. The skies were smoky for months. It really didn't stop being smoky until September. So from July through September, Sacramento, California, the capital of our state, completely smoked out. People were trying to suppress many of these fires, but there were so many going, it was impossible. Luckily, the weather wasn't extreme. The weather was actually quite moderate, so that allowed fires actually to burn under more moderate conditions, lower wind, higher humidity. And when we look at the fires today, the 2008 fires were by and large ecologically beneficial. Not every fire was, but when we saw afterwards the effects and the severity and the mortality, the area that burned in 2008 was actually quite useful in terms of restoration and management. So again, it shows us just the scale of burning that probably needs to occur for some real change in our ecosystems. Here's a slide I wanted to show you just some idea of what fire is doing. So now we're jumping just to the Sierra Nevada. The Sierra Nevada is one of the capstones of the state in terms of its vegetation, recreation, water supply, everything. So on the right side, you can see that there are some ideas of what fire used to do in terms of intervals. So up there on the top, Douglas fir forest, Pinus ponderosa, mixed conifer. Those are all very common forest types in the Sierra Nevada. And then the first number is an estimate of what fire used to do in terms of the number of years between successive fires. 12 to 17 years, 4 to 10 years. And the number below is the current fire return interval. So you can see for ponderosa pine, we estimate fire used to burn every 4 to 10 years. And in the last century, last 100 years, the return interval in ponderosa pine in California, Sierra Nevada is 275 years. So again, it just shows us how dramatic our forests are today in terms of what fire used to do. It's amazing how little fire we have, but it still gets a lot of political attention. We get big fires in this state, people start yelling and screaming, politicians make speeches, money comes from Washington, D.C. So it is a big event, but in terms, I just try to make sure people understand when I talk about this in California, that even with the big flames and all the cameras and all the smoke, the amount burning today is still trivial compared to what happened in the past. Just a tiny amount. Here's a couple pictures I like to show. Like you, we have a forestry program at UC Berkeley, and we have a summer camp. The summer camp is where the undergraduates go and take a summer study as part of the forestry curriculum. It's a neat place to go. It's been there since 1914. This turns out to be an old cabin made by the Forest Service, the United States Forest Service. This was actually built as a fire guard cabin. So this is the initiation of fire suppression in California. So this is actually 2 Forest Service employees around 1915 in the Pumas National Forest. That's in the northern Sierra Nevada. I just want you to take a look at the picture, and you can see a couple of the large trees right next to the cabin, and there's one behind it. So the Forest Service one of its prime missions was to try to eliminate fire, to try to keep it from burning in ecosystems. So the next picture will show you the same cabin, and take a look at those two big trees, the one in the dead center and the one to the left, and look what happens to this place in 2002. So those same trees are there. That one in the dead center you can see, and the one just to the left. The tree right here is actually the one in the previous slide, and the one here is also. Let me see if I can go back. So there's the two trees. This is a dramatic picture, and not every forest in the Sierra Nevada changed this much. There's no way they did. But you can see, it looks like in that picture, you can see 150 meters back behind the cabin. And then the next picture, you can see about 10 meters. So dramatic forest change. Unfortunately today, when people see a forest like in this picture, they think of it as old growth, beautiful, desirable, and they don't really have that notion of what it maybe used to be or how it used to be in terms of its dynamics, how it was in terms of its capacity to regenerate, to actually incorporate fire. So just a dramatic change in the forest structure. And what happens is today we have many forests, like the small picture, where we have very dense stands. And this really has important ecosystem changes, things like decomposition and nutrient cycling. Fundamental ecosystem processes have been really, really changed. The ecosystems are highly altered. The variability of the understory, the shrubs and the grasses that once used to grow here, has been heavily reduced. And we also know that fuels have accumulated in these systems, and that does correspond to high severity fire potential. So this is really what we have today. If we went to California and drove around the Sierra Nevada for 3 or 4 days, looking out the window, you would see stands like the picture over and over again. It is really the common structure that we have in the entire state. So then the ideas of fuel treatments. People have been working on fuel treatments in California and the western US probably since around 1990. So it hasn't been more than 20 years or so, 25 years. And through modification of forest structure, there are good examples of how fire interacts with those areas, and we can cause dramatic impacts. So here on the bottom, we see a wildfire moving down in the direction of the red arrow. This is the cone fire. Cone fire burned in very, very bad conditions, incredibly windy, very dry. And you can see that when it goes from the untreated condition to the treated condition, forest basically survives. So there's no doubt that I think today we have enough research and enough examples of wildfires hitting real forest structures that have been fuel treated that you can go from something like the top picture to below where you have an untreated condition. We know, at least in California, the critical issue is surface fuels and ladder fuels. Surface fuels are the material of the wood material that's on the forest floor that has accumulated through years. It's the deadened down woody material primarily, and the litter of the forest floor. The ladder fuels are these ideas of the trees that grow vertically that provide continuity to the overstory, so fire can move in from those and go up. In the Sierra Nevada, some research we've done, others show that 90% of the fire hazards are the surface fuels and the ladder fuels. The overstory trees, the big trees, the ones that we see and love to look at, they're probably only 5% of the fire problem. They're tiny. And that turns out to be a challenge from an economic standpoint, because if you're going to try to do this work, sometimes it can be costly, and you're trying to figure out how you can do that in decreasing budgets. But in terms of fire hazard, most of the problem in our forests is the surface fuel and the more moderate sized trees. Still, the trees can be relatively big. They can be 40 centimeters in diameter in California and still be part of the fuel bed. But they're not the ones that are going to be a meter diameter tree, which is a little unusual in California. That's not a fuel problem. That's something that we've learned through our research. Recently, we've tried to work with some more managers, and this is something I know that Domingo and you guys are working on with your new program, trying to connect to managers and trying to figure out how we can work together. And we've come up with these two publications on the right side. These are publications from the U.S. Forest Service. So these aren't peer-reviewed journal papers. These are basically science publications of the agency, the Forest Service. And it's been a really interesting exercise. I wasn't involved in both of these. I wasn't the lead in either, but I was a co-author on them. The first one on the top, we tried to summarize some of the ideas of ecosystem management and fire hazard reduction, trying to take the broader literature and trying to condense it down to managers so they might be able to look at that, read it. And we came up with this idea of a topography-based model where we have ridges with lower density trees because of higher fire frequency, and then down in the valley bottoms we could retain maybe canopy cover, higher levels, and maybe a north aspect where we have more shade and water, we could actually have also a different tree density. One thing we've done in California and in the United States is when we started to do fuel treatments, I think we tried to create a structure that looked a little like this everywhere. Very uniform, very, very few crowns touching, very few ladder fuels, so the understory was pretty clean. And I think we've come to realize that having that structure everywhere you want to do a fuel treatment is not desirable. Wildlife biologists, people that are interested in different parts of forests have asked serious questions about doing that. So we tried to come up with another idea that would allow fuel treatment to occur on big landscapes, but still try to conserve some of the other values, such as wildlife and recreation, things of that nature. This publication took us probably about 1.5 years to do. It took a while. And I really thought when it was done that it was something that would be on the desk and just collect dust. I really did. I thought it wasn't that much of a huge deal. You know, it was a synthesis of really existing data. We didn't do any new research. We just took the research that had been done the last 15, 20 years and tried to synthesize it. But to our surprise, the regional forester of California and the Forest Service chief in Washington, D.C. immediately saw it and started to promote it. And they thought of it as an idea that could be applied to vast regions, 20 million hectares in the western U.S. So today, the top publication is being used for planning and trying to do fire hazard reduction and restoration work over the entire western U.S. It took off like a wildfire, excuse the pun. But I was surprised that that synthesis had that ability to really change things. It changed it over 18 months. It didn't take years. So I do think that there's this opportunity for research and managers to work together that sometimes can really make a huge difference in terms of the capacity to move forward in land management. So that's exactly what that paper did. And it was actually quite surprising. We didn't think that would be the case. Whoops, wrong way. Now don't look at that crazy table. That's a bunch of numbers. But I wanted to give you a scale of what's going on in California today. This is a paper from Malcolm North and Brandon Collins and myself, the Journal of Forestry. It just came out this month. So the table tries to estimate what fire used to do in the Sierra Nevada. So that's when there was no suppression. And you can see to the left corner what's going on today. Well, the Forest Service, the United States Forest Service, which is the management agency of most of the land in the Sierra, it mechanically thins or does fuel treatments mechanically in about 11,500 hectares a year. This is current data. This is the last 5 years or so. Prescribed burning is around 3,300 hectares a year. Again, that's the average for the last 5 or 7, 10 years. And wildfires are burning around 20,500 hectares a year. So if you add all those up, mechanical, prescribed burning, and wildfire, you get around 35,000 hectares a year of change going on in the Sierra Nevada. So 35,000 hectares sounds like quite a bit. But down there in the bottom, you see that we think that based on the analysis in the table, that burning used to occur in around 200,000 hectares a year. So again, it just shows us that we're really, really behind. Estimate here is 18% of the land that needs treatment annually is being treated by these means of wildfire, prescribed burning, or mechanical. I think in most Mediterranean places in the world, these numbers are very similar. I was talking to Mark the other day about Spain and other things, and it's very challenging to work at the scales that used to burn in these systems. The one place I would have to mention, though, that is doing it is in Perth, Australia. Perth, Australia, which is in the southwest part of the country, that's a Mediterranean climate. They actually are burning at rates that are actually coincident with the historic numbers. Perth is burning enormous areas around their cities. In an area of about 2.5 million hectares in Perth, Australia, which is Mediterranean climate woodlands and forests and grasslands, They burn on average about 1/6 of that area every year. About 1/6 of the entire area, 2.5 million hectares. They've been doing that for about 1970 on. So in terms of an area of the world where fire management is really, I would say, making a significant difference at landscape scales in a Mediterranean region in the world, Perth, Australia is the only place I know. It's not without controversy. There are people there that are really concerned about wildlife causing maybe damage, too much burning occurring, maybe causing damage to wildlife. So there is some debate about it, but they are burning at the scale that probably once happened in their ecosystems. I want to show this last graph of the picture of our recent paper. The big bar is what we estimate used to burn annually in California. The historic bar here. Here's the historic bar right here. This is how much we think used to burn every year. Over here, you can't really see it. This is what we're doing today. Teeny little thing, right? So what happens is if you do an analysis of what used to burn historically and what's going on today, you find out that we call this the backlog. So this is the amount of area in the Sierra Nevada based on the current rates of fuel treatment that we basically say we expect no change for the next 20 to 30 years. And you can see that's around 60% of the entire landscape. So at the current rates of treatment, we expect that the Forest Service Sierra Nevada region, that over 60% of the land will be maintained and further degraded habitat for fire hazard. This is shocking. You know, you think about that, 60% of the entire Sierra Nevada at the rates we're treating today has really no input from fuel treatment. A terrible place to be. Just as simple as that. Well, I'm going to talk about Mexico for a minute because Mexico is a little bit different place. This is the Sierra San Pedro Martir in northern Mexico. It has a Mediterranean climate, precip around 50 centimeters. One thing about the Mediterranean climate, it's just in northern Baja, Mexico. So the little red diamond, that's where the mountain is. It's a peninsular mountain range, which half of it's in the United States and half of it's in Mexico. The international border splits it in two. So this is the area that we've been working now for around 15 years. It's pretty high elevation, close to 3,000 meters. Here we see that it does get snow in the winter. And the forests of the Sierra San Pedro Martir, one thing that they are that makes them interesting is that they have never been harvested, and fire wasn't put out until 1970. So this place is relatively remote. And it wasn't until 1970 when the first road was built. And with the road came some early fire suppression policies. But the place has never been cut, so it has that uniqueness of being relatively intact. Here's a picture of the upper plateau. Vallecitos Meadow was over there to the left side. Most of this is Jeffrey pine. So this is Jeffrey pine, which is similar to ponderosa pine. It's an area that encompasses a lot of variability. We see a lot of granite. This is granitic parent material. But this is an area we've tried to understand the dynamics of because it really is a place, in my view, that holds a lot of interest in terms of how a forest in a Mediterranean climate might actually operate outside of fire suppression and harvesting. Southern California has the same forest type. The peninsular mountains go through the international border. Half of them are in California, half are in Mexico. We had a drought from 1999 to 2002, a very severe drought for California standards. One year we only had 13 centimeters of rain in an area of forest. You can see that's a really dry condition. So the forest of both the Sierra San Pedro Martir and Southern California were under really drought stress. The next picture shows you what happens to many of the forests in California. There's no fire here at all. This is pure insect mortality. And you can see there's a bunch of houses in this area too, so it's got a big urban interface as well. So this is a place called Lake Arrowhead on the San Bernardino National Forest. So the drought, 4 years of drought, caused a wholesale collapse of the pinus forest in this area of California. Millions and millions and millions of trees die from bark beetle attack, from native insects, Dendroctrinus. What happens in the Sierra San Pedro Martir? That's only about 250 kilometers to the south. Well, lo and behold, we had that 4-year drought, and then we had a wildfire in the northern Sierra San Pedro Martir. They've been pretty good at putting out fires down there in the areas that are accessible. So this fire, even though it's only 400 hectares, is one of the few that actually are burned in the Sierra San Pedro Martir in the last 15 to 20 years. So you have to think about this a moment. So you got 4 years of drought, when sometimes 15 centimeters of precipitation, and then a wildfire starts and burns the forest. In California, that's a pure calamity. That's a disaster. Forest is not set up for that. It's just going to have terrible mortality. What happens in the Martir? So this picture right here is completely inside the wildfire. So that's that pinus forest after 4 years of drought and also being burned by wildfire. The next picture shows some Arctostaphylos manzanita shrubs under the understory. So the area burns under that really difficult conditions of drought and then fire. And amazingly, we see that there actually is incredible resilience to this forest. We did a study here, 16-hectare small watershed, and we wanted to get an idea of the mortality from the fire and drought. So we measured a bunch of things that are very typical for a fire effect study. Here's a small area of crown fire we see, where we see overstory mortality, and there was some. The shrubs in this system are very, very correlated to pockets of mortality, so the shrubs on the understory were really important. Here's an area that's completely missed in the wildfire. So the wildfire just misses big areas, burns others. So a tremendous amount of variation. Lots of variation inside the wildfire perimeter. So what's the end result? So after 4 years of drought and it burns in a wildfire, only 20% of the trees are dead. So that means 80% survive. The fire is very patchy, directly related to the heterogeneity of the forest structure and fuels. And we did some measurements afterwards, and we actually found that the fire maintained the heterogeneity. So it did not create a homogeneous effect. The feedback from the initial structure through the fire to the post-fire structure maintained that spatial heterogeneity in all aspects of forest structure. So this turns out to be one of the fires that really got our attention because of the ability of this place to take drought and then a wildfire and the forest to basically maintain itself. I think it's the most resilient forest I've ever seen in my life. So dry, burns in wildfire, and then maintains its capacity to regenerate and provide those ecosystem services we're all after. Here's my last slide. So the thing I think that the Martir has told us about, the Sierra San Pedro Martir, is high amounts of spatial and temporal variation is desired. Again, we didn't do this very well 10, 15 years ago. We were looking for very homogeneous conditions. When we did a fuel characteristics, we would go into a forest and try to do a fire hazard reduction. Trees would be individually spaced, never touching one another. The understory very homogeneous. I think today we want to have much more variation in that fuel treatment. Clumps of trees, gaps, openings, regeneration. All that occurs in the Sierra San Pedro Martir, and that's one reason why it's so resilient. I'm convinced of it. So now the Forest Service is actually trying to implement this idea of more heterogeneity in fuel treatment. And they're also doing another thing is managing wildfire. I know this is another part of the fuel treatment idea. Instead of trying to put every fire out, when you have a lightning fire in a remote area, you can actually maybe allow that fire to burn to a pre-established line and allow the fire actually back in the ecosystem under some conditions. And this also allows for more treatment in the landscape. By no means is that going to be simple, and there's risk associated with that, big time risk. One thing that we have a big problem with in California is a fire manager chooses to do that, and they follow the procedure as best they can, and then you have a change in wind. Something happens where the fire goes outside the predetermined area. Many wildfire managers are concerned that their careers could end. So there is still more work to be done on this idea of trying to allow managers to have more flexibility but also to allow them to have the ability sometimes to make a mistake and still allow them to maintain working and maintain the program. Managing wildfire in remote areas in California is probably the best way to start to reduce fuels at big scale. I know in Spain, I think you have far less region like that. There are much more people distributed in your country, and the ideas of doing that over a large scale, I'm sure Mark could tell you a lot more about that than I. But in California, there's no doubt there are millions of hectares of forest that this could happen. And I think it's something that we're going to hopefully proceed in. With that, I acknowledge it. I acknowledge my co-authors. All my papers are available at that website if you ever want to take a peek at them. And I'd be happy to answer any questions or whatever you want to do, Domingo.